Her hand landed on the back of my neck and she pulled me down into her lap in one motion. Certain, without preamble, my knees on either side of her thighs, and her other hand flat against the small of my back, holding me exactly where she had placed me. Heat flooded my lower body so fast I made a sound I had no preparation for. Her mouth found the hinge of my jaw and stayed there, and her hand tightened at my nape, and she said against my skin, low and deliberate, "You've been thinking about this since you walked in." I had been thinking about it for 5 years. If you want to hear uncensored too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. 4 hours earlier. I stood outside the Georgian townhouse on Gower Street with my second manuscript in a canvas bag and my hands shaking badly enough that I had to hold the strap with both of them. November had arrived in London the way it always does. Not with drama, but with a kind of grey, patient erasure, the light going flat and the air tasting of cold stone and distant rain. The brass plaque beside the door read, Caldwell and Voss Literary Press, in serif font that had not changed in a century. The building was 4 stories of Georgian brick, with tall sash windows and iron railings, and a front door painted a shade of black so deep it looked like it absorbed the street. I had looked at this door in my mind approximately 10,000 times in 5 years. In some versions of the memory, I had a clever thing to say. In most of them, I simply stood here exactly as I was standing now, holding a bag that contained 312 pages of the most honest writing I had ever produced, with my hands shaking and my stomach making a case for turning around. I had not been inside this building in 5 years, not since the day Noor Calder published a review of my debut novel so precise and so devastating that I stopped writing the morning I read it. The review had been 700 words. 700 words in the literary quarterly that had followed me across the internet for half a decade, that showed up when my name was searched, that agents referenced in polite rejection emails without ever directly naming. She had not been cruel. That was the thing I could never properly explain to anyone who asked. She had not been cruel at all. She had been accurate in a way that cruelty could never achieve. She had looked at my first novel, a thing I had spent 4 years building, that I had handed to the world with my whole nervous system exposed. And she had described exactly what was wrong with it in language so precise and so correct that I had not been able to argue with a single word. Technically competent, she had written, but emotionally sterile. The writer demonstrates considerable facility with prose construction and a near-total inability to access anything true about human experience. It reads as a performance of feeling rather than feeling itself. One expects and hopes that Ashby's next work will find its way to something more honest. One is not entirely optimistic. One is not entirely optimistic. I had read those 7 words approximately 40,000 times. I had read them in bed on a Tuesday morning with a cup of tea going cold beside me. I had read them standing in the middle of my kitchen in my socks. I had read them on my phone on the bus home from the bus, in the back room of the bookshop where I now worked afternoon shifts, shelving and reshelving and recommending other people's books because I had decided I was finished with the business of writing my own. That had been the plan. That had been the plan for 5 years, and it had been a perfectly adequate plan. And then 6 months ago, I had woken at 3 a.m. with a sentence in my head that was not technically competent and not a performance of feeling, and I had reached for the notebook I had kept on my nightstand out of some residual habit, even through the years of not writing, and I had written it down. And then the next sentence, and then the next. 312 pages later, here I was. She was editor-in-chief now. That was the other thing. When she had written the review, she had been a senior editor, and what she had been was enough. Her name carried weight in a way that other names in literary London did not, and her opinion had the quality of institutional fact rather than personal preference. But in the 5 years since, she had become editor-in-chief of Caldwell and Voss, which meant she had become, in practical terms, the arbitrating authority on serious literary fiction in this country. If she said a book mattered, it mattered. If she said it didn't, it didn't. The logic of this was not complicated. I had written a book that I believed was honest. The only person whose opinion of it could tell me whether I was right or wrong was Noor Calder. Going to anyone else would be the same as not going. It would be asking a question I had already answered to someone who didn't have access to the real answer. I had known this for 6 months. I had spent 6 months knowing it and finishing the manuscript and telling myself I would submit through the standard process, through the assistant editors, through the front desk, through the submission portal on the Caldwell and Voss website. I had spent 6 months not doing that. I had spent 6 months arriving, eventually and inevitably, at this door. The door opened before I knocked. Noor Calder stood in the threshold in a charcoal suit with her jet black hair pulled into a low twist at her nape, exactly the same way she had worn it 5 years ago. Exactly the same way she wore it in the photographs I had not been looking at. And looked at me with dark eyes that gave away nothing and said, in a voice I had forgotten, was that precise. Wren Ashby. I was wondering when you would come back. The physical effect of hearing my name in her voice, in person, was located specifically in the back of my throat. Not my chest. Not some vague cardiac region. The back of my throat, where something tightened and then refused to release, and for 1 full second, I could not produce a reply. I said eventually. It took me longer than I planned. She held my gaze for exactly 1 beat too long, a beat I felt as a physical event running from my throat down to the center of my sternum, and then stepped back from the door and held it open and said, "Come up." The townhouse smelled of old paper and radiator heat and something underneath both of those things that I could not immediately identify and then did identify. As I followed her up 2 flights of wooden stairs that announced each footfall with the particular creak of floors that have been carrying the weight of serious people for a very long time. Cedar and cold linen. That was Noor Calder's scent, close and specific and apparently preserved intact across 5 years in my memory. Activated now by the narrow stairwell and the fact that she was 2 steps ahead of me and I was at the precise altitude of her shoulder blades. I focused on the back of her jacket. The jacket was charcoal wool, perfectly tailored, with a tortoiseshell fountain pen clipped to the breast pocket. I looked at the pen and then looked away from it. I knew that pen. I knew it in the way you know the specific instrument of something that happened to you, not as an object, but as a sight. She had used that pen to annotate my first manuscript. She had used it to write the corrections and marginalia that accompanied the review, the pages she had sent back with the published piece, handwritten notes in dark ink beside every passage that had failed to reach what she called the emotional core. The pen had been there. The pen was still there. She still carried it in the same pocket. I was thinking about this when she stopped at the 3rd floor landing and opened a door into a corner office with tall sash windows on 2 walls, and the gray November afternoon came through the unwashed Georgian glass and softened everything it touched into something that existed slightly outside of time. She gestured to the wooden chair across from her desk. I sat. She did not sit. She stood beside the window with her back to the light, positioning herself so that whoever sat across from her was backlit while her own face remained in relative shadow, a choice so deliberate in its effect that it could not have been anything but intentional. And she reached up with one hand and removed her tortoiseshell reading glasses. Slow, deliberate. She folded them at the bridge and set them on the desk between us with the particular precision of someone who knows exactly what they are doing with their hands. The room was too warm. The radiator beneath the window ticked steadily as it expanded, and the sound filled the silence in the way that a low-frequency sound fills a room. Not loudly, but completely. I could hear my own breath when I tried to hold it. I could hear the particular quality of the air between us. She said, "You brought something. Not a question, an observation." She had already seen the canvas bag, already registered the weight of it, already understood what it contained in the way that a person who has spent 20 years reading manuscripts registers their presence as an atmospheric quality rather than a visual fact. I pulled the manuscript from the bag and set it on her desk. My hands were shaking, not the small, controlled tremor of someone who is managing nerves, but the visible, unmistakable shaking of someone whose body is expressing something her mind has not fully processed. The pages landed on the desk, and I placed both hands in my lap, and she watched and did not look away. She looked at my hands for a moment, then she reached across the desk. She pressed 2 fingers to the inside of my wrist where the pulse is closest to the surface, where the skin is thinnest and most forthcoming. The contact was cool, her fingertips noticeably colder than the ambient warmth of the room, colder than my skin, which had been flushed since the stairwell, and precise. She did not take my wrist. She did not hold it. She simply placed 2 fingers against the inside of it, against the exact location where my heartbeat was conducting itself in a way that was audible in its urgency. She said, very quietly, "Your heart is racing." I said nothing. I was using all available cognitive resources to keep my expression neutral. Her fingers stayed exactly where they were. The temperature differential was the specific difficulty. Her fingertips were cool against the heat that had been building in my forearm since the stairwell, since the door, honestly, since the moment she had said my name. And the contrast produced a sensation that traveled from the specific site of contact upward along the inside of my arm in a way that I could not accurately describe as unpleasant and could not accurately describe as anything I had a word for. She said, "Are you afraid of me? Or afraid I'll say yes?" The question sat in the warm air between us, and I looked at the two fingers still resting against my wrist and thought about answering it honestly, and thought about answering it dishonestly, and thought about the 700 words that had lived in my chest for 5 years and the 312 pages now sitting on her desk between the cold ceramic mug and the tortoiseshell pen. I said, "I'm not sure the two things are distinct." Something happened in her face. Not much. A small event at the corner of her mouth that might have been a response and might have been nothing. She held my gaze for a moment, and I held it back, and the radiator ticked, and my pulse ran hard and visible under her fingers. Then she lifted her fingers from my wrist and straightened, and I felt the absence of contact with an anatomical specificity that was difficult to account for. Not a general absence. The exact location, the inside of my wrist, approximately 2 centimeters below the pulse point, registered the withdrawal of her fingertips as a distinct and ongoing event. The skin there remained alert. It stayed alert for the duration of the silence that followed. She picked up the manuscript from the desk and turned to the window and began reading. The silence that fell between us was not empty. It was full of the specific sounds of a late November afternoon in a room that was too warm. The radiator, the occasional footstep in the corridor outside that did not stop at the door, the gray light shifting almost imperceptibly as the afternoon leaned toward evening, the faint sound of traffic from Gower Street 4 stories below, the exact quality of Noor Calder turning pages. She turned them with a deliberateness that was not slow but was not hurried either. A reading pace that suggested complete absorption and zero performance of absorption. She was simply reading. Her face in the gray light was composed and still and gave away nothing. I sat in the wooden chair with my hands in my lap and watched her not watching me and tried to breathe at a normal rate. The tortoiseshell pen on the desk between us caught the light at an angle. I looked at it for longer than was probably explicable, and then looked out the window at the flat gray sky above the London rooftops and thought about the morning 5 years ago when I had read the review, and the morning 6 months ago when I had written the first sentence of the second manuscript, and the particular quality of the silence between those 2 mornings, which had not been empty either, but had been full of the specific sound of a person who has stopped doing the thing that made them themselves. I thought about this for what felt like a long time and was probably 7 minutes. She said, without turning from the window, "You've changed your sentences." I said, "I know." She said, "They breathe differently." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She turned another page. The radiator ticked. I became aware that I had been holding a particular tension in my shoulders since I sat down and attempted to release it and did not entirely succeed. She said, "The scene in chapter 4, the one in the kitchen." I said, "Yes," she said. "That's the first true thing you've written." The sentence arrived in my chest with a physical weight I was not prepared for. Not the location I would have predicted. Not the throat or the sternum. The center of my chest, approximately where the ribcage parts. A pressure that was not pain and was not relief and was very precisely the sensation of something that has been compressed for 5 years, being given without warning a small amount of space. I said very carefully, "Only the first." She turned then from the window, manuscript still in hand. She looked at me across the desk in the gray afternoon light, with her dark eyes and her composed face, and the ghost of something at the corner of her mouth that I filed without examining. She said, "The first I've reached so far." She turned back to the window. I sat in the wooden chair and felt the inside of my wrist where her fingers had been and listened to the radiator and tried to construct a thought that was not about the temperature of her fingertips. I was not successful. The afternoon continued to dim around us. She read. I sat. The footsteps in the corridor came and went without entering. At some point she set the manuscript down on the desk and reached for the cold ceramic mug and lifted it toward her mouth and stopped, registering its temperature, and set it back down without drinking. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "I'm going to make more coffee. You can stay or you can go." It was not an invitation. It was a description of the available options, offered in the same tone she might use to describe weather. I noted the flatness of it and the effect it produced in my chest, which was something I would have called irritation, and which was almost certainly not only that. I said, "I'll stay." She looked at me for exactly 1 beat longer than the statement required and then left the room. The door did not close behind her. I listened to her footsteps on the wooden stairs, descending, then the distant sound of a kitchen on a lower floor, then the silence of an office where the person who fills it has temporarily vacated and sat in the particular quality of a room that belongs to someone, saturated with their presence in their absence. The manuscript sat on the desk. The tortoiseshell pen sat beside it. The cold mug sat beside both. I looked at these objects in the gray November light and felt an emotion I was not going to name, and felt the inside of my wrist and felt the specific quality of the room without her in it, which was quieter and smaller and colder than the room with her in it had been. She was back in 6 minutes. I know because I had been counting, without deciding to count, the way your body keeps certain measurements without your permission. She set a new mug of black coffee on the desk. Not beside mine, because I had not been offered any, but in the specific location where the cold mug had been, and she remained standing and she removed her reading glasses again. The same motion. Slow, deliberate, one hand. She folded them and held them rather than setting them down this time, the frames loose between her fingers. She said, "Why did you come to me specifically? Not why did you come back? Not why now? Why did you come to me specifically?" The specificity of the question was itself specific, and I sat with it for a moment and decided to answer it honestly, because I was tired, and because the room was too warm, and because I had spent 5 years being precisely dishonest in the way her review had described, and whatever I was doing now, I was not doing that. I said, "Because you were right." She was very still. I said, 5 years ago. "You were right, and I knew you were right when I read it, and I couldn't prove you wrong by writing something that proved you wrong to anyone else. I had to prove it to you." She looked at me with her dark eyes and her reading glasses loose in her hand and the gray light at her back. The tortoiseshell frames caught the light at the same angle the pen had. She said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me." I said, "I've been here for less than an hour." She said, "I know." Something moved in her face. Not much. The same small event at the corner of her mouth, slightly more defined this time, pressing into something that was almost an expression. Almost. She looked down at the reading glasses in her hand and then back at me. She said, "I'll finish reading tonight." I said, "All right." She said, "Come back tomorrow." I said, "All right." She said it in a tone that was not a request, and the not request produced in the inside of my wrist the sensation that I had been carefully not examining since she had lifted her fingers from it. And I stood from the wooden chair and reached for my canvas bag, and she watched me stand with an expression I was not going to try to interpret. Because I was 28 years old, and I had spent 5 years working in a bookshop, and I did not know what I was doing in this room. She walked me to the door of the office and stopped there, in the frame, and I moved past her into the corridor. At the distance of passing her, in a door frame, I was close enough to catch the cedar and cold linen again, closer than the stairwell, the doorway being narrower, and it produced in the back of my throat the same tightening it had produced on the way up. She said to my back, as I started toward the stairs, "Wren!" I stopped. I turned around. She was standing in the door frame with one hand on the frame and her dark eyes on me and the reading glasses still in her other hand and the charcoal suit and the jet black hair and the specific quality of stillness that was not stillness because it was costing something to maintain it. I could see what it was costing. I do not know how I could see it. "I could see it," she said. "You should know that the scene in chapter 4 is not the only true thing." I looked at her in the door frame in the corridor light and felt that sentence arrive in the same location the earlier one had, the center of my chest, the place where the ribcage parts, and felt it differently. I said, "I know." She looked at me for one more beat. Then she went back into her office, and the door closed, and I stood in the corridor for 3 seconds with my hand on the wooden banister, and then I went down the stairs. I came back the next morning. The assistant I spoke to at the front desk, a young man with careful glasses and the slightly compressed posture of someone managing a great deal of ambient seriousness, told me Noor was available and walked me up the 2 flights and knocked on the office door and held it open and I went in. She was behind her desk this time, seated. The manuscript was open in front of her with her tortoiseshell pen in hand and several pages marked with her handwriting in a dark ink I recognized from 5 years ago. She did not look up immediately. She finished the note she was writing. I watched her write it with an attention I was not distributing evenly across the room, And then she set the pen down and removed her reading glasses and looked at me. The glasses went on the desk between us. She said, "Sit down." I sat in the wooden chair. The room looked different in morning light. Still gray, the November sky over London committing fully to its seasonal character. But the quality of the gray was different, higher and more diffuse. And the radiator was already running, and the room was already warm. The manuscripts on the desk in their 3 stacks had not moved. The ceramic mug had been replaced with a fresh one. My manuscript lay across the stacks at an angle, as if she had set it down in the middle of reading and had not straightened it. She said, "I read it." I said, "And," she said, "and you were right to come." The sentence did something specific to the air in the room. I could feel it as a physical event, a pressure change, a shift in what the silence between us was made of. I sat with it for a moment without speaking, and she sat with it too, and the radiator ticked and the gray morning continued outside the unwashed Georgian glass. I said, "That's not a yes." She said, "It's not a no either." I said, "Those aren't the same thing." She looked at me. The dark eyes behind, no, without the glasses, set now on the desk between us, were different from the eyes behind the glasses. Not because they looked different, but because the glasses had been a mediation, a small instrument of professional distance, and their removal left something more direct in the air. She said, "I have questions about Chapter 9. I said, "Ask them." She opened the manuscript to a page she had marked and asked her questions, and I answered them, and she made notes with the tortoiseshell pen. And I watched the pen move across the margin of my own pages and felt the inside of my wrist, which had continued its quiet registration of the previous day's contact in the hours since, with a fidelity I would have preferred it to exercise elsewhere. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the most specific conversation I had ever had about my own writing. She asked about intention, and I answered with what the intention had actually been. She asked about a particular choice in the final chapter, and I said what the choice had cost me to make. And she set the pen down and looked at me in a way that was not a professional look and was not anything I had a clean category for. She said, "When did that happen?" I said, 6 months ago. She said, "What changed?" I said, "I stopped lying to myself about something." The corner of her mouth did the thing it had done yesterday, more fully this time, tilting into something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family as one. She looked down at the manuscript and then back at me and said, "It shows." I said, "You're not going to tell me what it is." She said, "No." I said, "Because you don't know, or because you're not going to." She held my gaze for a beat that lasted long enough to be a different kind of statement. She said, "Because it doesn't matter what it was. It matters what it produced." I sat with that. The radiator ticked. She picked up the pen again and made another note. I looked at her hands, at the way she held the pen, at the specific angle of her wrist on the desk. I looked at the inside of my own wrist where the desk's edge was pressing lightly against the exact location her fingers had pressed yesterday, and I noted this without acting on it. She set the pen down. She said, "I want to continue this conversation. I have a meeting at 11. Can you wait?" I said, "I work this afternoon." She said, "What time?" I said, 3. She looked at the clock on the wall behind me. Then she looked at me. She said, "I'll be done by 12:30. There's a place on Museum Street that does good coffee." It was not an invitation. It was again a description of available facts. I noted the pattern of this, the way she offered information without ornamenting it, without social softening, without the conversational upholstery that most people wrap around requests to make them easier to accept or decline, and noted what it did to my sternum, which was something I was not going to name. I said, "All right." She nodded once. Then she stood, and I stood, and she came around the desk and held open the office door. And as I passed through the doorframe again, I was again at the distance of cedar and cold linen, and again the back of my throat registered it with the same precision it had on the way in, on the way out, on the stairwell, ascending and descending. I waited in the cafe on Museum Street with a coffee I was not drinking, and the particular quality of alertness that belongs to a person who is pretending to be calm. I read 3 pages of a novel I had brought and retained none of it. I looked out the window at the narrow street and the gray November sky and the people moving through it with their coats and their purposes, and thought about the scene in Chapter 4, which she had called the first true thing, and what exactly it had cost me to write it. She arrived at 12:34. I know because I had been watching the door with a precision I would have preferred not to possess. She came in from the street in the charcoal suit and the low twist and ordered coffee at the counter without looking at a menu, and brought it to the table and sat across from me and set her reading glasses on the table between us and looked at me. I said, "You order without looking at menus." She said, "I've been coming here for 12 years. I said, "Do you always have the same thing?" She said, "Yes." I said, "What is it?" She said, "Black coffee." I said, "That's not a thing. That's a modifier." The corner of her mouth moved. Fully this time. It became a real expression, brief and precise, lasting approximately 1.5 seconds. I cataloged it in the way I had been cataloging things she did, without intending to catalog them. She said, "You're more argumentative than I expected." I said, "Did you expect to like it?" She looked at me. She said, "I didn't say I liked it." I said, "You didn't say you didn't." She looked at me for a beat that I held, and then she looked at her coffee. And then she looked back at me, and I could see what it cost her to hold her expression where it was. We talked for 1 hour and 40 minutes. We talked about the manuscript, and then we talked about other books, and then we talked about the neighborhood, about Bloomsbury, about the particular quality of working in a space that is saturated with the weight of things that have been written and published and decided, and she spoke about it with a specificity that was not enthusiasm. She did not speak with enthusiasm about anything, or not visibly, but with something more durable than enthusiasm, a kind of precise and ongoing attention to the things that mattered to her. At some point I said, "Do you like what you do?" She said, "That's an unusual question." I said, "Most editors I've spoken to talk about their work the way people talk about weather. It's just the condition they exist in." She said, "Most editors aren't deciding what gets into the conversation." I said, "Is that what you think you're doing?" She said, "Isn't it what I'm doing?" I said, "I think what you're deciding is what gets counted, what gets the permission to matter." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's exactly what I'm deciding." She said it without pride or apology, just as a fact, the way she said most things. I sat with it and felt the inside of my wrist and thought about 700 words in the Literary Quarterly and thought about 312 pages on her desk and thought about the particular quality of being seen accurately by someone, the specific discomfort and relief of it, and how those two things are not actually opposites. She said, "I have to get back." I said, "All right." She stood, and I stood, and she left the money for both coffees on the table before I could say anything about it. Not as a gesture, but as a simple execution of intention. And I noted this, and noted what it did to the inside of my forearm, which was a different location from my wrist, but adjacent. Outside on Museum Street, she stopped and turned to me and said, "Tomorrow, same time, my office. Not a question." I said, "All right." She looked at me for one beat. Then she turned and walked back toward Gower Street, and I stood on the pavement and watched her go, and felt the cedar and cold linen fading from the air around me with the specific quality of something that was being subtracted. I came back the next day, and the day after. The pattern assembled itself without discussion or announcement, the way certain things assemble, not negotiated, but arrived at, the way water finds the lowest point not by deciding to, but by being water. By the 4th day, I was coming in at 10 and leaving at 2 to make my afternoon shift at the bookshop, and Noor was reading my manuscript out loud to me in sections and asking me about the choices in a voice that did what it did to the back of my neck with a regularity I had given up trying to manage. On the 5th day, she stood and came around the desk while I was still talking, and I watched her come around it and kept talking, because stopping would have acknowledged something I was not ready to acknowledge. She stood beside my chair, not across from me, not at the desk, beside the chair, and reached down and removed my reading glasses which I had been wearing because I had forgotten to put in my contacts, and she set them on the desk with the same deliberateness with which she set her own glasses down, and I stopped talking. The room was very warm, the radiator was running. The gray light through the unwashed Georgian glass had taken on the particular quality of late November afternoon, pressing toward evening. And Noor Calder was standing beside my chair in her charcoal suit, with her dark eyes on me and the reading glasses in her hand, mine and hers, both now. And the cedar and cold linen was at the distance of beside rather than across, which was a different distance, and my body was doing what my body had been doing for 5 days, with increasing clarity and decreasing capacity for my mind to provide an alternative explanation. She set my glasses down on the desk next to hers. She said, "You've been avoiding something for 5 days." I said, "I've been discussing your editorial notes." She said, "That too." The radiator ticked. I could hear my own breathing. She said, "You know what I'm going to say." I said, "I know what I'd like you to say. Those aren't the same thing." Something shifted in her face. Not the corner of the mouth event. Something different. Something in the quality of her attention, the specific weight of it. And she reached down and pressed her fingers to my jaw. Not my cheek, my jaw. the side of it, the hinge, where the bone is close to the surface and the skin thins over it. Her first 2 fingers resting there with a cool, deliberate pressure that was not a touch of comfort and was not a medical assessment and was not a professional gesture. It was precise. It was claiming something, the specific pressure of those 2 fingers against the hinge of my jaw, in the same way that the 2 fingers on my wrist on the first day had claimed something, and the claiming was quiet and specific and completely unmistakable. She said, "Look at me." I looked at her. She said, "I'm going to publish your manuscript." I said, from what felt like a considerable distance, "That's not what you were going to say." She said, "No, but it's true." She did not move her fingers from my jaw. I said, "Nor." She said, "Yes." I said, "Your fingers are on my face." She said, "I know." I said, in an editorial context. She said, very quietly, "No." The warmth from those fingers had changed. They had been cool when they first touched, and they were warming now, my skin warming against them, or them warming against my skin, the boundary between those 2 things becoming unclear. And the radiator ticked, and the gray afternoon pressed against the Georgian glass, and I was sitting in the wooden chair in the corner office on Gower Street with 5 years of the most specific silence I had ever experienced, pressing behind my sternum, and the woman who had put it there with 2 fingers against the hinge of my jaw. She said, "Say what you came here to say." I said, "I came here about the manuscript." She said, "Wren." I said, "I came here because you were right about me 5 years ago. I came here because being seen by you and being wrong was less survivable than coming back to show you you were right." She was quiet. I said, "That's not a normal reason to go to your editor." She said, "No." I said, "I know." She said, "And," I said, "and I've been thinking about what it means that I came back to you specifically for the entirety of the past week, and I have not arrived at a comfortable conclusion." Her fingers moved, not away, not adding pressure, a small lateral motion against the hinge of my jaw, a kind of adjustment, her thumb coming up to rest against my cheekbone with a coolness that was already becoming warmth. She said, "What kind of conclusion did you arrive at?" I said, "The kind I was already at on the first day and have been trying to file under something else since." Something in her face shifted, not the small event at the corner of her mouth. Something in the eyes, the quality of attention, the particular weight of her gaze on my face, which I felt as a physical event precisely located in the top of my chest where the sternum ends. She said, "I know." I said, "You know." She said, "I knew on the first day. I have been waiting for you to say it." I stared at her. I said, "You've been waiting." She said, "You needed to get there yourself. You always needed to get there yourself. That's the thing about you, Wren. You can't be brought anywhere. You have to walk in." The sentence arrived, and I sat with it and felt the thumb against my cheekbone, and the fingers at the hinge of my jaw, and the cedar and cold linen at the distance of standing beside a seated person, which is the distance at which everything becomes specific and necessary and no longer deniable. I said, "Is that what you're doing? Waiting for me to walk in?" She looked at me for a beat that lasted long enough to be a kind of answer. Then she said, "Take your coat off." I stood, and she stood back to let me stand, and I unclipped the canvas bag from the chair and set it on the floor, and I took off the second-hand camel wool coat and held it for a moment, and she reached and took it from my hands and set it on the arm of the wooden chair with a deliberateness that was not efficiency. Her hand brushed the inside of my forearm when she took it, brief, the back of her fingers against the inside of my forearm through the cream wool of the turtleneck sleeve, and I felt this in the skin that was underneath the wool. She said, "Sit back down." I sat. She remained standing beside the chair. She said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like you to answer it honestly." I said, "All right." She said, "What stopped you from writing for 5 years?" I said, "You know what stopped me." She said, "I know what you've been saying stopped you. I'm asking what actually stopped you." The question sat in the warm air, and the radiator ticked, and the afternoon pressed against the glass. I said, "I was afraid you were right." She said, "I was right." I said, "I know." She said, "But that's not what stopped you." I looked at her. I said, "Being seen and being wrong. By you specifically. It's different when the right person sees you and you aren't ready to be what they're describing." She looked at me with the quality of attention that felt like a physical weight on my sternum. She said, "And now?" I said, "And now I think I've been afraid you were right in a way that isn't only about the writing." The sentence landed between us in the warm, quiet office, and I felt it land and watched her face for the small events that told me something was happening underneath the composed surface, and found them. A slight shift in the quality of her stillness. The same event I had learned to read in 5 days of sitting across from her. The thing that happened in her when something reached her that she had not expected to reach her, even when she had been expecting it. She said very quietly, "Yes," I said. "Yes," she said. "That's what I thought." She reached down again and placed both hands on my jaw this time. Cool, deliberate, the same temperature differential I now associated with every point of contact with her, and tilted my face up and looked at me for a moment that I experienced as having no specific duration. And then she said, "You've been thinking about this since the first day." I said, "Longer than that." She looked at me. She said, "How much longer?" I said, "Since the review." Since the morning I read it and understood that someone had seen me clearly and I was not ready to be seen. Since the specific moment I understood what it meant that it was you. Something happened in her face then. Something more than the small events I had catalogued, something that moved across her features with a speed and quality that was different from composure. That was the opposite of composure. A single unguarded moment that I watched and that she allowed me to watch, and that would have been devastating from any distance. And then it resolved back into stillness, but not the same stillness. The stillness after that was different. Her thumbs against my cheekbones pressed slightly. She said, "Stand up." I stood. She held my face in both hands, and I was standing in front of her, and she was taller, and the cedar and cold linen was at the distance of no distance, and the gray afternoon was all around us, and the radiator was ticking, and my pulse was doing what my pulse had been doing for 5 days at a rate that I was no longer attempting to normalize. She said, "I am going to make a decision." I said, "All right," she said, "and once I've made it, there's no going back to whatever this has been." I said, "I know." She said, "You're sure?" I said, "Nor." She said, "Yes." I said, "Yes." She pulled me down into her and sat back on the desk behind her and brought me with her. Not roughly, but with a certainty that made roughness unnecessary. Her hands coming from my jaw to my waist, and then one to the back of my neck, and I landed with my knees on either side of her thighs on the edge of the desk, and her other hand flat on the small of my back, and the heat from the radiator and the warmth from her hands and the cedar and cold linen at no distance at all, flooding up and through me. Her mouth found the hinge of my jaw, where her fingers had been, where she had first touched me, deliberately, precisely, without calling it what it was. 2 fingers against the hinge of my jaw in an office in Bloomsbury in late November. Her mouth was now, and the pressure was warm and specific and completely intentional, and her hand tightened at the back of my neck, and I felt the pressure of it along the entire top of my spine. She said against my skin, her voice low in a register I had not heard it in before. A register that did something to my lower body that I was not going to describe in terms that required clinical vocabulary. "You've been thinking about this since you walked in," I said, against her hair, which had come slightly loose at the nape from its twist, the jet black strands warm against my cheek. "I've been thinking about it for 5 years." Her hand at the small of my back pressed. Her other hand at the back of my neck moved. Her thumb tracing the line at the base of my skull, slow and deliberate, the same deliberateness with which she had removed the reading glasses and placed the 2 fingers at my wrist and tilted my face up with both hands. And what this produced in the skin of my neck and from there downward was not something I was going to account for neutrally. She said, "Then we've both lost time." I said, "Were you thinking about it too?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I published the review." I said, "That's not an answer." She said, "It's the most honest answer I have." I pulled back enough to look at her face. Her face at this distance, no distance, was different from her face across the desk, different from her face through the doorframe. The composure was still there, the structure of it, the precise features and the dark eyes. But something underneath it was visible in a way it had not been across the desk. She had made a choice to let it be visible. That was the most specific thing I could say about it. She had decided, with the same deliberateness with which she made every decision, to let me see it. I reached up and took the tortoiseshell reading glasses from where they had come loose from her breast pocket, dislodged at some point in the motion that had brought us to this, and I held them in my hand and looked at them. She watched me hold them. I said, "You've been carrying these for 5 years." She said, "They're glasses." I said, "They're the ones you used on my first manuscript." She was quiet. I said, "I know because the tortoiseshell is cracked at the left hinge." It was cracked in the photograph from the Literary Quarterly Review, the one they published with your name. She looked at me, the dark eyes at no distance. She said, "You looked at that photograph?" I said, 40,000 times, approximately. Her face did the thing, the unguarded thing. Again, longer this time. And when it resolved into something that was not composure, and was not its opposite, but was a third thing, something I did not have a name for, that I felt as a warmth in my chest that was separate from and in addition to everything else that was warming. She said, "Give them to me." I held them out. She took them from my hand, not the glasses, not first. She took my hand, both of hers around it, the glasses between our palms, and held it for a moment that had a duration I was not going to measure. Then she set the glasses on the desk beside us. Her hands came back to my face. She said, "The manuscript is good," I said. "I know." She said, "It's more than good," I said. "I know." She said, "You're not surprised." I said, "I'm surprised you're saying it out loud." She tilted my face down toward hers, both thumbs against my cheekbones, the cool then warming pressure at both hinges of my jaw, and said, "I have been economical with you for 5 years. I think I have been economical enough." I said, "You destroyed my career." She said, "I returned it to you. You'd have published the first one and spent the next 10 years building a reputation for something that wasn't yours." I said, "That was not your decision to make." She said, "No." I said, "You made it anyway." She said, "Yes." I said, "And now?" She said, "And now you came back." I said, "And now I came back." She looked at me with the quality of attention that I had felt for 5 days as a physical weight and was feeling now as a different weight, at a different location, further down than the chest. She said, "What do you want?" I said, "You know what I want." She said, "I want to hear you say it." I said, "That's very editorial of you." The ghost of the smile, real now, present at both corners of her mouth, changing the geography of her face in a way that I felt in my lower body with a precision that was now familiar. She said, "Ren," I said, "I want you to accept it." She said, "The manuscript." I said, "Yes, and everything else?" She said, "Everything else." I said, "You know what I mean." She said, "Say it plainly." I said, "I have been in love with you, in some form, since the morning I read those 700 words and understood that you had seen something in me that I had not managed to see in myself. And then I spent 5 years being angry about it. And then I spent 6 months writing the most honest thing I have ever written, and then I walked through your door, and I am here, and I am saying it plainly." The room was very quiet. Her hands on my face were warm now, not cool. They had been warming for some time, and I had been tracking the shift with the part of my attention that I had given up pretending was doing anything else. She said, "I knew when you walked in on the first day." I said, "You knew what?" She said, "That you had written something true. I knew it from how you held the bag. I knew it from how your hands were shaking." I said, "You pressed your fingers to my wrist." She said, "Yes." I said, "That was not an editorial gesture." She said very quietly, "No." I said, "How long?" She said, "That's a question I'm not going to answer tonight." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because tonight I'm going to do something instead of answering questions." Her mouth came to the hinge of my jaw again, the specific location, the point of return, where she had first claimed something without naming it, and this time it stayed. And what it did there, warm and deliberate and specific, was everything the earlier contact had announced, and everything I had been trying to file under something else for 5 days and had not successfully filed. Her hand at the back of my neck pulled me closer. The other hand moved from my face to my waist and then lower to the small of my back, pressing me into the warmth between us, and I stopped trying to account for what my body was doing and allowed it to account for itself. The manuscripts on the desk beside us rustled in some draft from the window. The radiator ticked. The gray November afternoon had become evening outside the unwashed Georgian glass, and the room was warm and dark and smelled of cedar and cold linen and coffee and the specific quality of a room where something has been decided. I said her name against her throat. She made a sound, low, quiet, involuntary. The first sound I had heard from her that was not chosen. I felt it as a physical event in my lower body and also in my chest, in the 2 locations simultaneously, which I was learning are not as separate as I had previously organized them. She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm going to need you to hear something." She said, against my jaw, "I'm listening." I said, "I am not forgiving you for the review." She was quiet for a moment, Then she said, I know, I said. I'm saying that plainly. I'm here and this is happening and I am not forgiving it. I'm choosing it alongside it. She pulled back enough to look at me. The dark eyes in the dim room, the composed face undone in specific and catalogable ways, the hair loose at the nape, the jacket slightly disarranged, the quality of something in her expression that was not composure and was not its absence, but was the third thing again. The thing I was learning had a temperature and a weight. She said, I know the difference. I said, all right. She said, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I said, what are you asking for? She said, I'm not asking for anything. I'm here. I looked at her. I said, that's the most honest thing you've said to me. She looked at me for a beat. Then she said, I've been here the whole time. And she pulled me back into the warmth and the cedar in the dark, and her hands were on my face, and then on my waist, and then, her palm flat against the small of my back, holding me exactly where she had placed me. Everywhere. And the room was warm, and the radiator was ticking, and the gray evening was pressing against the Georgian glass from outside. And I was exactly where I had been walking toward for 5 years, without knowing I was walking. Her hand tightened at the back of my neck. Her mouth was at the hinge of my jaw. Heat moved through my lower body, and my hands found her and pulled, and she made the sound again. The chosen, unchosen sound, the sound that cost her something. And said against my skin, You've been thinking about this since you walked in. I said, longer. She said, I know. She kissed me then, not at the jaw, the mouth. Direct and precise and without social softening, which was exactly how she did everything, which was exactly why it arrived with the weight it arrived with. And I felt it in my throat and my chest and my lower body and the inside of my wrist where her 2 fingers had been on the first day. And all of these locations are the same location. I understand now, they have always been the same location. And it took 5 years and 312 pages, and a woman who saw me clearly before I was ready to be seen to bring me to this particular convergence. Her hands held my face. Mine held her. The manuscripts sat on the desk behind us. The tortoiseshell pen lay beside them. The reading glasses, hers, lay where she had set them. Mine were somewhere on the desk, overlapping with hers or separated by an inch. I had lost track and did not retrieve it. Later, much later, we lay on the wooden floor beside her desk with our coats and jackets serving as impractical but functional substitutes for furniture, and her head was on my shoulder and her hand rested with a specific, deliberate weight on my bare stomach. The manuscript sat on the desk above us, coffee-stained on 3 pages from a mug she had displaced with her elbow at some point neither of us had stopped to address. And the night had come fully down outside the Georgian windows, and the city was making its city sounds, and the radiator was ticking, and the room was warm. I said, You haven't finished reading it yet, she said, without moving. I finished it last night. I said, Then you've been pretending to read it for 2 days. She said, I've been rereading it. I said, For what purpose? She was quiet for a moment. She said, To find the place where you stopped lying. I stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was Georgian plaster with a faint crack running diagonal from the window toward the center, and I looked at the crack and felt her hand on my stomach and the warmth of the room and the specific quality of the silence between us, which was different from all the previous silences, saturated with something that had been expelled rather than held. I said, Did you find it? She said, Chapter 4. I said, That's what you said the first day. She said, I know. I said, And now. She said, And now I've read it again, and I was right, and I was also wrong. I said, About. She said, Chapter 4 is the first true thing. But it's not where you stopped lying. Where you stopped lying is the 3rd paragraph of Chapter 1. I was quiet. I said, What's in the 3rd paragraph of Chapter 1? She said, You know what's in it. I said, I know what I put there. I don't know what you're reading. She lifted her head from my shoulder and looked at me. In the dark room, the city light coming through the Georgian glass, she looked different again. She had a face that changed with the light, or that I was learning had more faces than the one it wore across the desk. She said, The 3rd paragraph of Chapter 1 is a woman standing outside a door. She has not been through in 5 years, holding a bag. With her hands shaking, I said, That's not autobiographical. She looked at me. I said, Not fully autobiographical. She said, It's the first sentence where you aren't performing anything. It's the first sentence that exists because it needed to exist, and not because you thought it was what a novel should sound like. I felt this in the same location I felt everything she said. The center of my chest, the place where the ribcage parts, and also in my throat. And I did not say anything because I did not trust what my voice would do. She said, "I'm going to publish it." I said, "I know." She said, "It will be the best thing I publish this year." I said, "That's very confident," she said. "I'm very confident. It's not a flaw." I said, "No, it isn't." She laid her head back on my shoulder, and her hand resettled on my bare stomach with the same deliberate weight as before, and the radiator ticked, and the city was dark outside, and I looked at the diagonal crack in the Georgian plaster and felt the inside of my wrist, which was at rest. I said, "Did you want me 5 years ago?" She was quiet for a long time. She said, "That's the question I told you I wasn't going to answer tonight." I said, "It's not tonight. It's past midnight." A pause. Then from her, something that was not a laugh, but was in the same territory as one. Brief, precise, released and retracted. She said, "No." Then she said, "Yes." Then she said, "Both of those are true. And the way they are both true is the most complicated answer I have." I said, "Tell me anyway." She said, "I didn't want you the way I want you now. I wanted something for you that I knew you couldn't reach yet. I wanted the version of you that could write chapter 4. I wanted that to exist." I said, "And the review?" She said, "Was the only tool I had." I said, "It was a devastating tool." She said, "Yes." I said, "You knew it would be devastating." She said, "Yes." I said, "And?" She said, "And I thought the devastation was survivable, and I thought what was on the other side of it was worth reaching." I lay in the dark on the wooden floor of a Georgian editorial office in Bloomsbury and felt the weight of her hand on my stomach and thought about 700 words and 5 years and the third paragraph of chapter 1 and what it means for someone to see what you could be and want it badly enough to do the damaging thing to get you there. I said, "I don't know whether to be furious or grateful." She said, "You can be both." I said, "I already am." Her hand on my stomach pressed slightly. An acknowledgement. The press of fingers against skin is a whole language if you learn to read it, and I was learning to read it, and what it said was, I know what this costs. I know." The room was quiet, the radiator was ticking. Outside, London was being London at whatever hour this was. And inside the Georgian townhouse on Gower Street, a woman who had destroyed my first novel and a woman who had spent 5 years not writing a second one were lying on the floor of the editor-in-chief's office, on their shared jackets with the manuscript above them and the coffee stain on 3 pages, and the morning not yet, but coming. I said, "I'm not forgiving you." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm choosing this anyway." She said, "I know." I said, "Those are different things." She said, "The most important things always are." I looked at the ceiling, the diagonal crack in the plaster, the Georgian glass holding the city light in its unwashed panes. I said, "Noor." She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm going to write another book." A pause. She said, "I know." I said, "Are you going to destroy that one too?" She said, very quietly, with the quality of precision that was the most specific thing about her, "No." She said, "That one I'm going to publish." Her hand on my stomach moved. The fingers spread across my ribs. A deliberate, possessive, warm placement of a hand, which was everything it was and nothing it was pretending not to be. I said, "You're very sure of yourself." She said, "I've read what you can do. I'm not guessing." Morning came through the unwashed Georgian glass, not dramatically, not with the light that announces itself, but the way November mornings come, slowly and without permission, the gray becoming slightly less gray, the room resolving out of the dark into its familiar geometry of manuscripts and tall sash windows, and the wooden chair and the desk above us with the coffee-stained pages. I woke first, or I did not sleep and therefore did not wake. I lay in the early gray and looked at the ceiling and felt her hand still on my ribs and the weight of her against my shoulder, and thought about the third paragraph of chapter 1, which I could recite from memory because I had written it and rewritten it and written it again, and which I had not known she was in until she said it. She stirred eventually. She did not say anything when she woke. She lay still for a moment, and then she sat up and looked at the room in the morning light with the composed expression she wore the way other people wore their faces. And then she stood and straightened her jacket, which she had been sleeping in because the floor was cold, and went to the window. She stood at the window in her charcoal suit, with her hair retwisted. She had done this at some point in the night or morning, efficiently and without ceremony, the jet black hair back in the low twist at the nape as if the night had not happened to it. And she picked up the tortoiseshell pen from the desk, clicked it, and opened my manuscript to the page she had left off and began to annotate. She did not look up when I dressed. I watched her for a moment, the back of her at the window, the pen moving across the margin of my pages, the gray November morning coming through the Georgian glass and diffusing into something that softened everything it touched. And I felt, in the inside of my wrist and in the center of my chest and in the specific place behind my sternum where 5 years of a particular kind of silence had lived, something that was not resolution and was not forgiveness and was not what I had expected to feel at the end of anything. It was closer to beginning. I picked up my bag. I put on my secondhand camel coat. I wound the blush scarf around my neck. At the door I stopped. I said, "Noor," she said, without looking up. "Yes," I said. "I'll be back this afternoon," she said. "I know." Her pen kept moving, her back to the light. The manuscript opened beneath her hand, the tortoiseshell pen crossing my pages in her dark, precise ink. I said, "Are you going to look up?" A pause. She looked up. And across the distance of the office, the desk between us, the manuscripts in their stacks, the cold ceramic mug, the morning light through the Georgian glass, she looked at me with dark eyes that gave away everything, and she removed her reading glasses, and she folded them and she set them down. She said, "Go. You'll be late." I said, "I'm always late." She said, "I know. Go anyway." I went. Outside on Gower Street, the November morning was cold and gray and specific. And the Georgian townhouse stood exactly as it had stood for a century, with its brass plaque and its black door and its tall sash windows. I walked toward the tube with my canvas bag and my hands no longer shaking and the cedar and cold linen still present in the fibers of my scarf where I had wound it, and thought about 312 pages and 700 words and the third paragraph of chapter 1 in the inside of my wrist, which was warm